Current world chess champion Magnus Carlsen, considered by many to be the greatest chess player of all time, was defeated by young American grandmaster Hans Niemann 3 times in 3 different tournaments. First, Magnus was defeated by Hans in the FTX Crypto Cup, breaking his 53-game unbeaten record in classical chess. Magnus is white here. The game starts with the Sicilian defense, Njezmetinov Rosolimo fianchetto variation. We'll skip the theory here. Hans centralizes his queen on d5. Magnus attacks Hans' bishop with the rook. Hans takes it back, attacking the rook now. Magnus attacks Hans' queen, forcing it to retreat. Then Magnus saves his rook. Hans pushes his kingside pawns, forcing Magnus' bishop to retreat. Hans plays rook d8. Magnus plays pawn h3, stopping any bishop g4 or pawn g4 plans from black. Magnus plays pawn a3 with the idea of pawn b4. Hans doubles his rook on the d-file, whereas Magnus goes ahead with his plan on the queen side. Here, Magnus defends the d3 pawn with rook. Hans plays queen g6, attacking the pawn again. Magnus defends with his knight, which allows Hans to push his pawns on the king side, gaining significant advantage. Hans plays e6, stopping the move pawn e6 by Magnus. A few moves later, Hans finally plays pawn g4, weakening Magnus' king side. They trade, and Magnus forces Hans' bishop to retreat with f3, then plays f4, making space for the knight to come back to f3. After one move, Hans plays his queen to g4, attacking Magnus' rook and pawn on f4. Magnus plays rook f3, trying to save them both, but this loses a rook. Hans finds the best move, bishop e4. This attacks the rook, but the rook can't move anywhere, since that would lead to losing rook on d1. So Hans takes the rook for his bishop and becomes exchange up. The game continues for a few more moves until Magnus Carlsen resigns. This is what Hans said after the game.
Today, you start out with a masterpiece. How would you summarize it?
Chess speaks for itself.
Is it something special doing this against Magnus, Hans?
In number 2, we have Hans defeating Magnus in the Sinkfield Cup. Magnus is white here. He plays the Queen's Gambit, and Hans replies with the Nimzo Indian. The game is equal until Hans threatens to capture Magnus' bishop. Magnus plays rook d1, attacking the queen, which is a slight mistake. Hans plays bishop e6, the best move in the position. Magnus takes queen on c8. Hans does the same. The rooks are swapped. Bishop takes knight. Hans takes back. Magnus plays king f1. Here, black is in a better position, even though there are double pawns, because the pawns a3 and c3 are isolated and can easily become a target. Hans plays rook d8, king e1 by Magnus, knight a5, rook d1. Hans keeps the rook on the board to target the weak pawns. Magnus plays knight d2, bishop e6. Magnus plays pawn c4, giving up a pawn for counterplay. Bishop takes, knight takes, rook takes, check. Bishop d5. Hans plays rook c7, preventing rook d7. A few moves later, pawn f5 is trying to play e4 next and bringing the king in. After a few more moves, black is 2 pawns up. Rook d7. Hans spots the best move, e3, takes, knight e4, threatening rook c1. Magnus can't allow this to happen since it loses the bishop. So he plays king f1. A few moves back, black was pawn up and had double pawns, but now white has double pawns and black is still pawn up. This is simply losing for white. The game goes on for a few more moves until Magnus resigns. Magnus quits the tournament after this game and insinuates that Hans cheated. This is what Hans replied.
So demoralized because he's losing to such an idiot like me, you know? It's just, it must be embarrassing for the world champion to lose to me. Chess.com has suddenly decided to hop on Magnus's...
In number 3, Magnus resigns in just 2 moves against Hans Niemann in the Julius Baer Generation Cup as a protest, so that FIDE acts against Hans for cheating. After this, Hans files a $100 million lawsuit against Magnus, Hikaru, and Chess.com for falsely accusing him of cheating. Although the Wall Street Journal has found that Hans likely cheated in more than 100 games, we still don't know whether he really cheated against Magnus.
I've never, ever in my life cheated in an over-the-board game.